With only hours left before his execution, a man asked for just one thing: to see his husky Balto. But what happened when the dog arrived would expose a dark secret, silence an entire prison, and prove that loyalty can outlive even death itself. The sun hadn't yet risen over the cold gray walls of Redwood State Penitentiary. The air inside was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that only exists before something final. Even the guards moved slower that morning, as if each step carried the weight of what was about to happen. Behind one of those locked steel doors sat Ethan Cole, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes unfocused, fixed somewhere between memory and regret. It had been 7 years since the trial, 7 years since the night that took his freedom, his career, and almost his will to live. They said he had killed his co-worker in a fit of rage. The evidence had been clear, the jury swift. But those who looked deeper, if anyone ever truly had, would have seen the cracks, the inconsistencies, the quiet hands of someone framing him. Ethan stopped fighting long ago. What was left of his resistance had faded with every passing year, replaced by a dull, tired acceptance. Yet that morning, something stirred inside him, not hope, not fear, but longing. A single memory kept replaying in his mind. 2 blue eyes staring up at him from beneath a snowy porch, a small husky pup wagging its tail in pure joy. Balto. He hadn't seen that dog since the day they dragged him away in handcuffs. The thought of those eyes, that howl echoing behind the police car, still haunted him. Balto was the last piece of his old life that hadn't betrayed him. When the warden Harris entered his cell, the atmosphere shifted. Harris wasn't cruel like some of the others. He was a man who carried the weight of every execution on his shoulders. He looked at Ethan with calm authority. "Cole," he said, "it's time to record your last request." Ethan lifted his gaze slowly. His voice came out quiet but steady. "I want to see my dog, Balto." For a moment, Harris didn't respond. The request hung in the air like a strange echo. "Your dog?" he repeated. Ethan nodded once. "He was taken when I was arrested. I need to see him. One last time." Down the corridor, 2 guards exchanged glances. They'd heard plenty of odd last requests. A man once asked for a guitar, another wanted to eat breakfast at midnight, but never this. A condemned man choosing to see a dog instead of his family or priest. It made no sense. But to Ethan, it made perfect sense. He didn't want forgiveness from strangers or last words that would vanish into empty air. He wanted truth, something real, something that hadn't turned its back on him. Balto had been there before the world fell apart. That loyalty deserved a goodbye. Warden Harris leaned against the cold concrete wall, fingers tapping the file in his hand. "You understand the complications, Cole? Bringing an animal into a maximum security facility, especially today, isn't standard procedure." "I understand," Ethan said, "but please, that's all I want." There was something in his voice, something that stripped away the hardened exterior of a man on death row. Harris sighed. "I'll see what I can do." When he left, the room felt emptier than before. Ethan sat in silence, staring at the faint light crawling through the narrow window. He didn't pray. He didn't weep. He just whispered one name, Balto, and waited. In the control room, officers debated. "It's a security risk," one said. "We've never let an animal inside these walls." Another countered, "The man's got no visitors, no family. Let him have this. It's 10 minutes in the yard. What harm can it do?" Warden Harris watched the discussion with furrowed brows. He pulled Ethan's file again. Clean record. No fights, no escape attempts, no disciplinary issues. It was unusual for someone on death row to behave like that for years. At the bottom of the file was a personal note. Owned a Siberian Husky named Balto for 8 years. Dog seized at arrest. Something in that detail stayed with him. Maybe, Harris thought, granting this request wasn't about mercy. It was about closure. Finally, he spoke. Under strict supervision, yard only. 10 minutes. Across town, a white transport van rolled down an empty highway. Inside, a handler sat beside a husky with thick silver fur and piercing blue eyes. Balto stared out the small window, ears twitching at every sound. The handler had worked with dozens of dogs, but none like this one. Balto was calm yet alert, as if he understood exactly where he was going. "You've been quiet all morning," the handler murmured. "You know where you're headed, don't you?" Balto didn't move. His eyes reflected the world passing by. Fences, fields, clouds heavy with rain. Somewhere deep inside, the dog remembered a scent, a voice, a face. When the van turned through the massive iron gates of Redwood Penitentiary, the guards stiffened. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to tighten. The idea of a husky entering a death row yard felt surreal. But Warden Harris's order was clear. The dog and the prisoner would meet. As Balto was let out of the van, the chain jingled softly against his collar. His paws touched the cold ground, and for a brief second, the world seemed to pause. He sniffed the air, tail flicking once, twice, then froze. His ears perked, nose lifting toward the wind that carried the faintest scent of someone long lost. His tail began to wag, slow at first, then faster, his breath forming little clouds in the morning chill. Ethan stood in the middle of the yard, his wrists loosely cuffed. Guards flanked him, watching closely. Beyond the wire fence, the sky was pale and merciless. He could hear the gate creak open behind him. The sound of claws on concrete reached his ears, a rhythm his heart recognized instantly. He turned. Balto appeared from the far end, led by two officers. The dog's silver coat gleamed under the pale sunlight, eyes scanning the space until they found him. In that instant, the years between them collapsed. Balto pulled against the leash, the officers struggling to hold him back. Warden Harris gave a single nod. "Let him go." The leash fell slack. Balto sprinted. Ethan dropped to his knees as the dog collided with him, bearing his head against Ethan's chest, whining and howling in a sound that was half joy, half pain. Ethan wrapped his arms around him, burying his face in the thick fur, breathing in the scent of home snow, leather, and something pure. For those few minutes, the prison vanished. No walls, no guards, no death sentence. Only a man and his dog, two souls finding each other again after 7 years of darkness. Yeah, but then something changed. Balto froze. His body stiffened, ears flattening, eyes narrowing toward a figure standing at the edge of the yard, Officer Briggs. The husky's growl was deep, primal, echoing off the concrete walls. Guards turned in surprise. "Control your dog!" one shouted. Ethan placed a trembling hand on Balto's back. "Easy, boy, easy." But Balto wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on Briggs, fur bristling, teeth bared. Ethan could feel the vibration of that growl through his hands. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. Briggs shifted uneasily under the dog's stare. "This is ridiculous," he muttered and turned away, disappearing through the gate. Balto's growl faded, but his body stayed tense, his eyes fixed on the spot where Briggs had stood. Ethan's mind spun. Balto had never acted like that before, not toward anyone, and dogs, especially Balto, didn't growl without reason. He looked down at the husky, who now sat beside him, tail still and head low. Ethan whispered softly, "What is it, boy? What do you know?" Balto didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth Ethan sensed had just walked out that gate, and for the first time in 7 years, the condemned man felt something new rise inside him. Not resignation, not despair, but the faint trembling spark of hope. The morning sky had turned pale gray by the time the guards led Ethan back to his cell. The air still carried the scent of Balto's fur, earthy, wild, familiar. Ethan sat on the edge of his cot, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from what he had just witnessed. Balto's growl still echoed in his ears. That deep, guttural sound hadn't come from anger or confusion. It had come from something deeper instinct. He had seen his husky react to danger before. Once, years ago, Balto had stopped him from entering a garage where a gas leak was filling the air. Another time, he refused to approach a stranger who later turned out to be wanted for theft. Balto had a way of seeing through people, of sensing what words and appearances hid. That growl in the yard wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, whispering to himself, "Why him, Balto? Why Briggs?" Across the corridor, Officer Ramirez, one of the few guards who treated inmates with quiet decency, paused outside his cell. "You all right, Cole?" he asked softly. Ethan looked up. "My dog." He growled at Officer Briggs, like he recognized him. "You ever see him before?" Ramirez frowned. "Briggs? He's been around a long time. Keeps to himself mostly." "Why?" Ethan hesitated. "I think Balto knows something." Ramirez chuckled under his breath. "Your dog's smart, no doubt. But be careful, Cole. You start pointing fingers around here, people won't take it kindly." He started to move on but stopped, lowering his voice. "Still, between you and me, Briggs was working the night you got arrested." Ethan froze. "He was?" "Yeah," Ramirez said quietly. "But funny thing is, his name's not on any of the official reports." The words hit Ethan like a hammer. He had long accepted his fate, buried any thought of appealing. But now a flicker of something dangerous stirred in him, the will to fight back. Later that afternoon, Harris summoned him again. Ethan was escorted to a small interview room, the same one where he had first signed his confession years ago. This time, though, Balto was there, lying obediently at his feet. The Husky's blue eyes stayed sharp, tracking every movement around them. The warden sat behind a metal desk, flipping through documents. "Cole," he said without looking up, "what happened in the yard?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke. "Balto recognized someone, Officer Briggs. He growled like he does when he senses danger. That dog never forgets a scent." Harris looked up now, his gray brows furrowing. "You're saying your dog recognized Briggs from before?" "I'm saying he reacted for a reason. He was at my house the night of the arrest. He must have smelled him before." The warden sat back, considering. "That's a serious accusation. You understand what that implies?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what I saw and what Balto saw." Harris studied him for a long moment. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent light. Balto's tail tapped the floor once, then stilled again. The door opened and Officer Briggs stepped in, his posture stiff. His eyes darted toward Balto. The Husky's body tensed instantly. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not loud but unmistakable. Harris raised a hand. "Easy now." Balto's lips curled slightly, showing a hint of teeth. Briggs swallowed hard. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "It's an animal. Probably just nervous." Charwifurni. But Harris was watching both men closely, the way Briggs avoided Ethan's eyes, the sheen of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air. Something about it didn't sit right. "Officer Briggs," Harris said evenly, "were you on duty the night of the Cole arrest?" Briggs's jaw tightened. "No, sir. I was off duty, at home." Ethan said nothing, but Balto growled again, louder this time. Briggs stepped back, glaring. "You gonna let that mutt threaten an officer?" Harris's voice remained calm. "That'll be all for now, Briggs." Briggs turned sharply and left, slamming the door behind him. Silence lingered. Balto's gaze stayed fixed on the closed door, unblinking. Harris finally exhaled. "He's lying," he said quietly. "I can feel it." Ethan looked down at Balto. "He knows it too." That night in his cell, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every image replayed in his mind the moment Balto froze, the growl, the fear in Briggs' eyes. It wasn't just instinct. There was history there. In the early hours, Ramirez appeared again, slipping a folded paper through the bars. "Don't ask me how I got this," he whispered, "but you might want to read it." Ethan unfolded it carefully. It was an internal report, one that had been sealed during his trial. It listed the officers who arrived at his home the night of the murder. 3 names. One of them was Briggs. Ethan's breath caught. His pulse quickened. The missing piece was right there, buried in bureaucracy and lies. Balto lifted his head, sensing the change in his master's heartbeat. Ethan reached through the bars and stroked the Husky's head gently. "You were right, boy," he whispered. "You always were." The dog's tail thumped once, quietly, as if acknowledging a promise made between them long ago. For the first time since his arrest, Ethan didn't feel like a condemned man. He felt like someone standing at the edge of the truth. And if there was still a way to expose it, Balto had just shown him where to start. That night, beyond the concrete walls and electric fences, A cold wind swept through the valley. The moonlight poured through the narrow slit of his window, touching Balto's fur with silver light. Ethan whispered into the darkness, his voice steady. "We're not done yet." Balto raised his head, ears pricking forward as if he understood every word. Then with a soft exhale, he lay back down beside the cot, eyes open, guarding his master as he had always done. Somewhere in the shadows of Redwood Penitentiary, the first thread of truth had begun to unravel. Morning broke cold and quiet over Redwood Penitentiary. The steel corridors glowed faintly under the buzz of flickering lights. Ethan lay awake long before the wake-up bell, staring at the ceiling. Every thought circled back to one name: Briggs. The discovery Ramirez had smuggled in the night before left no room for doubt. Briggs had been there the night of his arrest, the same night evidence appeared that sent him to death row. Balto sat upright beside the cot, alert and restless. He had barely slept, his ears twitching at every sound. When footsteps echoed down the corridor, his head lifted instantly, eyes narrowing. Ethan reached over and laid a calming hand on his fur. "It's okay, boy," he whispered. "Not yet. We'll get there." The heavy door clanked open. Officer Ramirez appeared. His expression was serious, cautious. "Cole," he said quietly, "Warden wants to see you again. Bring the dog." Ethan's heart kicked hard against his ribs. He stood, cuffs clicking around his wrists. Balto followed without hesitation, his stride proud and certain, the faint jingle of his collar the only sound breaking the silence. They were escorted into the same interview room as before. Warden Harris was already there, a pile of folders stacked before him. Beside him stood a woman in a dark suit, Detective Sarah Monroe, an investigator from the state's Internal Affairs Division. Her expression was calm but sharp, like someone used to reading the truth behind masks. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand, "I've reviewed parts of your case file. Warden Harris requested an internal review after yesterday's incident." Ethan nodded slightly. "You mean after my dog growled at an officer?" Her lips curved faintly. "Let's just say it raised a few questions. Officer Briggs's personnel records are missing a night's worth of logs, the same night you were arrested." Ethan swallowed hard. "I knew it. Balto reacted to him for a reason." Harris opened one of the folders, revealing photos and reports. "We've reopened access to evidence that was locked during your trial," he said, "including the murder weapon." He slid a photo across the table, a rusted wrench with faint smudges of prints. "New testing methods have advanced since then. We're having everything re-examined." Ethan's voice was low. "You think it'll matter after 7 years?" "It might," Monroe replied. "Truth doesn't expire. Only patience does." Balto shifted, sniffing the air. His gaze locked again on the door as if he sensed someone approaching. A moment later, the door opened and Officer Briggs stepped inside. He didn't expect to see Ethan there. His stride faltered, his eyes darting immediately to Balto, who let out a low, sharp growl that made the air vibrate. "Control your animal," Briggs snapped, his voice tight. Ethan stayed calm. "He's just telling the truth in his own way." Briggs glared at him. "This is ridiculous. You think a mutt's instinct means anything in a courtroom?" But Monroe wasn't watching Ethan. She was watching Briggs. The muscle in his jaw twitched when he spoke. His hands fidgeted with his belt, and a sheen of sweat glistened at his temple. "Officer Briggs," she said slowly, "you were working the night of the Cole arrest. Why didn't you disclose that in your written statement?" Briggs shifted his weight. "I was off duty. I stopped by to assist when I heard the call." "Then why isn't that reflected in dispatch logs?" Monroe's tone sharpened. He didn't answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The silence grew thick. Balto stepped forward, the fur along his back rising, eyes locked on Briggs. Monroe leaned back. "Warden Harris, I'd like a copy of all shift rosters for that night, and I want Briggs temporarily reassigned pending review." Harris nodded slowly. "Agreed." Briggs's face turned pale. "You can't be serious. Over a dog?" Monroe looked him dead in the eye. "Over the truth." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the lights flickered. Balto let out one last bark that echoed down the corridor, like a final accusation. After Briggs left, Harris rubbed a hand over his face. "Cole, you might be right. I don't know how deep this goes, but we're reopening your case officially. Execution is suspended effective immediately. Ethan froze, barely breathing. You mean? Monroe nodded. It's not over yet, but you're not dying tomorrow. Balto pressed his head against Ethan's leg as if understanding every word. Ethan's hands trembled as he stroked the husky's thick fur. We're not free yet, boy, he murmured, but it's a start. That night, the entire prison buzzed with quiet rumors. Guards whispered about Briggs's sudden removal from his post. Some believed Ethan had made a deal. Others said the dog had gone mad. But those who had been in the yard that day, the ones who saw Balto's eyes, heard that growl, they weren't so sure. In his cell, Ethan sat beside Balto, who lay stretched out at his feet. Ramirez came by after lights out, whispering through the bars. They found something, he said. Detective Monroe had the evidence retested this evening. The fingerprints on the wrench don't match yours. Ethan's breath caught. Whose then? Ramirez's eyes flickered. They're still confirming, but word is, it's Briggs. Ethan felt a surge of disbelief, relief, and rage all tangled into one. He turned to Balto, his voice rough. You knew. You always knew. Balto's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. Ramirez added, They're sending the results to the court tomorrow morning. If it checks out, your conviction could be overturned. When the guard left, Ethan sat for a long time, listening to the hum of the prison at night, the distant footsteps, the clang of metal doors, the restless murmur of men who'd given up long ago. He looked at Balto, sleeping lightly, ears twitching even in dreams. He whispered, If it wasn't for you, I'd be dead by now. Balto stirred, opening one blue eye, and exhaled softly, almost like a sigh. The next day brought more movement. Detectives arrived. Files changed hands. Briggs was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it he'd been taken into custody quietly before dawn. Monroe met Ethan again, her expression firm but warmer now. The evidence is clear, she said. The prints, the witness statement, everything points to Briggs. He planted the wrench, staged the scene, and pinned it on you. He thought no one would ever look again. Ethan's voice cracked. Why? Why me? Greed, Monroe said simply. The man you were accused of killing had uncovered corruption in the department. Briggs was part of it. He silenced him, and you were an easy scapegoat. Ethan leaned back, eyes closing. For the first time in years, the walls didn't feel as heavy. He could breathe again. As Monroe prepared to leave, she bent to scratch Balto's ear. You've got yourself one loyal guardian, she said softly. If it weren't for him, none of us would have looked twice. Balto licked her hand once, then looked up at Ethan, his blue eyes bright, reflecting a truth that words could never capture. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the walls, Ethan stood by the small barred window. Beyond it lay a world he hadn't touched in 7 years. But now freedom was no longer a dream. It was a promise. He placed his hand on Balto's head and whispered, Tomorrow everything changes. Balto leaned into his touch, tail swaying slowly. Outside, the sky burned gold before fading into the dark. Inside, hope, once buried, finally found its way back into the heart of a man and the dog who had never stopped believing in him. The morning of Ethan Cole's release began with the sound of rain tapping softly against the iron bars. The same gray light that had haunted him for years now seemed gentler, washed clean. The world outside those walls felt close enough to touch, yet still a dream. He sat on his cot, his heart steady but heavy with disbelief. It had been a week since the truth broke open, since the evidence cleared his name and Briggs was taken away in cuffs. But after 7 years of silence, even justice felt foreign. The door opened quietly. Warden Harris entered, holding a folder in one hand, an umbrella in the other. Cole, he said, his voice softer than usual. The governor signed the order this morning. You're a free man. Ethan looked up slowly, eyes wet with a restrained emotion. It's really over? It's over, Harris confirmed. Briggs confessed last night. He admitted to everything. Planting the wrench, falsifying reports, even threatening witnesses. You were the scapegoat. Ethan didn't reply right away. His gaze fell to the floor, and for a long moment, he just breathed. Freedom wasn't something he had imagined anymore. It had become an idea too distant to believe in, and yet here it was, real and raw. "Balto?" he asked. Harris smiled faintly. "Waiting at the gate." Two words were enough to break the wall that 7 years of pain had built. Ethan stood, his body trembling, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the weight of what awaited beyond that final door. The corridor to the exit seemed longer than he remembered. Every sound echoed, the metallic clank of locks, the shuffle of boots, the whisper of guards watching in quiet respect. He passed the spot where he had first walked in, a condemned man, the same cold floor, the same smell of metal and stone, but now every step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of his soul. As the final gate swung open, rainlight poured in like liquid silver. The world smelled different, clean, wet, alive. Ethan stepped outside, blinking against the sudden brightness, and there, a few feet away, stood Balto. The Husky's fur gleamed under the drizzle, his blue eyes fixed on the figure emerging from the gate. The moment their gazes met, Balto's tail began to move. Once, twice, then he broke into a run. Ethan dropped to his knees as Balto collided with him, paws pressing against his chest, a soft, broken howl escaping from the dog's throat. Ethan buried his face in the Husky's neck, feeling the warmth, the weight, the heartbeat that had carried him through the darkest years of his life. The world around them blurred. There was only this, man and dog, two souls finally reunited without bars between them. "You did it, boy," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "You saved me." Balto pressed closer, licking the tears that streamed down his face. The guards by the gate turned away quietly, pretending not to see the tears in their own eyes. Even Harris, standing under his umbrella, looked down, jaw tight. When Ethan finally stood, Balto stayed close, his tail brushing against his master's leg. Together they stepped beyond the fence, into a world that had moved on without them, but somehow still waited. They walked slowly down the long, wet road leading away from the prison. The air was cool and smelled of pine and rain. Every breath Ethan took felt like the first real one in years. The weight of concrete, steel, and judgment lifted with each step. He looked down at Balto, who trotted beside him, ears up, eyes bright, alive in a way that only freedom could bring. Reporters waited farther down the road, their cameras flashing. Someone shouted a question, another yelled his name, but Ethan didn't stop. He had no statement, no bitterness to share. The only answer he gave was the quiet strength in the way he held his head, the way Balto stayed by his side, silent and dignified. They reached a small car parked by the road. Ramirez stood there in plain clothes, holding out a folded piece of paper. "It's your release certificate," he said, "and a little something extra." He handed over an envelope. Inside were photographs, pictures of Balto taken by the handlers over the years. Ethan looked at them, his throat tightening. "You kept these?" Ramirez smiled faintly. "Didn't have the heart to throw them away. He never let anyone near his cage after you got sentenced. Guess he was waiting." Ethan nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "So was I." Before they parted, Ramirez crouched to scratch Balto behind the ears. "You're one hell of a detective, aren't you?" he said with a laugh. Balto barked once, sharp and proud, as if agreeing. They drove away in silence. The highway stretched wide and endless before them. For a while, Ethan said nothing. He just watched the landscape roll past, watched raindrops race each other down the window. Balto sat in the passenger seat, nose pressed against the glass, eyes scanning the horizon. When they reached the old house, his parents' place, abandoned but still standing, Ethan parked in the driveway. The grass was overgrown, the paint faded, but the smell of home was still there. Balto jumped out, ran ahead to the porch, and barked once as if to say, "We made it." Ethan followed, stepping inside the house for the first time in almost a decade. Dust covered everything, but it didn't matter. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was peaceful. Balto wandered through the rooms, sniffing corners, tracing old paths. Then he came back, sat in front of Ethan, and looked up, the same way he had when he was just a pup, waiting for direction. Ethan knelt beside him. "No more cages," he whispered. "No more walls." Balto wagged his tail and laid his head on Ethan's knee. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof, but inside the house, warmth bloomed. As evening fell, they sat by the window, watching the storm ease into twilight. The last light of the day painted the sky gold and violet. Ethan's eyes softened as he spoke quietly. "You know, they called me a murderer, a liar, a monster. But you never doubted me, not once." Balto raised his head, eyes glowing with quiet understanding. "That's the thing about you," Ethan continued. "You don't need proof. You just know." Outside, the clouds broke apart, revealing a sliver of the moon. The world felt wide again, full of noise and color and chance. Ethan stood, stretching, and opened the front door. Cool air swept in. Balto bounded past him, leaping into the yard, spinning in the wet grass like a pup again. Ethan laughed, a sound he hadn't made in years. He stepped out after him, the mud soaking through his shoes, the rain washing away the last traces of the past. Balto barked and turned in circles before running back to him, tail high, fur dripping. Ethan dropped to one knee, caught his face in his hands and smiled through tears. "You brought me back to life, Balto. You really did." They stayed like that for a long time, man and dog, in the heart of a storm that no longer frightened them. Later, when the clouds cleared completely and stars filled the sky, Ethan whispered, "From now on, wherever we go together." Balto gave a soft, contented huff, his eyes closing as he leaned against Ethan's chest. The world hadn't changed much. People still hurried, storms still came, and justice was still too slow. But for Ethan and Balto, none of that mattered. They had found what everyone seeks and few ever truly grasp: loyalty that never falters, love that never needs words, and a truth so pure it could only be spoken in silence. And as the night deepened, the wind carried their story into the distance, a story not of crime or punishment, but of faith, instinct, and a dog who refused to forget. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Hit subscribe, give this story a like, and stay tuned. Tomorrow's episode will move you even deeper.